Chapter 11. Abraham's Last Years. Sarah died at 127 years old, and I was there when it happened. Not on the perimeter, not at my post. I was near the tent, close enough to hear the change in her breathing when it came. The slow, measured rhythm that had sustained her through decades of impossible life, carrying a promise in a body that shouldn't have been able to carry anything. Giving birth at 90, nursing a child at an age when most women's grandchildren were already grown. That rhythm faltered, stuttered, stopped. Abraham had been beside her for hours, the household knew. Sarah had been declining for weeks, her strength draining the way water drains from a cracked vessel, slowly and then all at once. The servants had gathered near the tent. Isaac stood outside, a young man now, his face carrying the controlled grief of a son who knows what's happening and can't change it. When the breathing stopped, Abraham wept. This man had faced Pharaoh and Abimelech and the kings of the East. I'd watched him raise a knife over his own son, argue with God and lie to kings, build altars in the wilderness and walk through a famine without breaking. But I'd never seen him weep like this. Deep, uncontrolled. The sound of a man whose companion for over 100 years has left him in a way that no promise or covenant or angelic protection can prevent. Death. The one enemy I couldn't fight. The one cost I couldn't mitigate. God had protected Sarah from Pharaoh and from Abimelech and from barrenness and from every threat the fallen had devised. But he hadn't protected her from time. From the wearing of a body that had been miraculous and was now, finally, finished. Angels gathered, not for war, but for witness, for honor. Sarah had carried the seed promise in her own body, had prayed at a stone in Ur until her hands wore it smooth, had laughed at God's promise and lived to laugh at its fulfillment, had endured her husband's fear and her own desperation and the complicated aftermath of the Hagar scheme, and had stayed. Through all of it, had stayed. Heaven marked her passing. The gathered angels were quiet, present, honoring a human life that had mattered to the story of creation in ways that Sarah herself had probably never fully understood. Abraham negotiated for the cave of Machpelah. I watched him sit with the Hittites at the city gate, his eyes still swollen from weeping, conducting business with the careful precision of a man who refuses to let grief make him careless. 400 shekels of silver for a burial site. In land that God had promised to give his descendants for free. He didn't own the land yet. God's promise of the entire territory of Canaan remained unfulfilled. But Abraham owned this cave, this tomb. This first small piece of tangible inheritance, purchased not by promise but by silver, witnessed by the people of the land. He carried Sarah's body into the cave, laid her down in the darkness, and stood at the entrance for a long time, looking into the place where his wife's body would rest until the promise that ran through her was fulfilled in ways neither of them had lived to see. The first legal landholding in Canaan, a grave. That seemed right somehow. The promise beginning not with a palace or a city or a field of grain, but with a place to bury the dead. As if God were saying, even here, even in death, even in loss, the promise holds. Years passed. Isaac grew into a man who looked like his mother and prayed like his father and carried the weight of being the promised son with a quiet steadiness that I found more moving than Abraham's dramatic faith. Isaac didn't argue with God or lie to kings or scheme with servants. He just lived. Tended the flocks. Built the altars. Believed the promise without needing to test it. Abraham grew older, 150. The years accumulated on him like layers of earth on stone, each one pressing him further into the ground he'd been walking since Ur. The inheritance went to Isaac. Abraham made sure of that. He gave gifts to the other sons and sent them east, away from Isaac, the way he'd sent Ishmael away years before. The seed line was specific, the covenant was narrow. And Abraham, who had learned the hard way what happened when you tried to widen God's plan with human solutions, kept the line clear. Then Abraham called for his chief servant, the old man, the one who'd managed the household since before Isaac was born. Abraham sat with him and gave him an assignment that carried the weight of everything they'd built together over a century of wandering and believing. "Find a wife for Isaac," Abraham said, "not from the Canaanites, from my people, from the land where I was born." "What if the woman isn't willing to come?" the servant asked. "Should I take Isaac back to the country you came from?" Abraham's response was immediate. "Do not take my son back there," Abraham said. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel ahead of you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. He will send his angel ahead of you." I looked at Michael. Michael looked at me. "Go," Michael said. I traveled with the servant. Across the miles that Abraham had walked decades ago, back toward Haran, back toward the land where Terah had died and Abraham had buried his father and heard God's voice a second time. The servant carried 10 camels loaded with gifts and the faith of a man who believed God would provide. The fallen knew what the journey meant before I did. Within a day of leaving Hebron, 2 of Sariel's scouts were tracking us from the eastern ridge. By the second day, 4, not attacking, mapping. I recognized the pattern from the same patient surveillance that preceded every serious operation. Sariel understood that the seed line needed to continue through the right woman, and he had 100 ways to prevent that without breaching my perimeter. A family that refused. A girl already promised elsewhere. A road that led the servant to the wrong well. I fought 3 probes before we reached Nahor and lost ground on the second one. They got close enough to the servant's lead camel to spook it, and I spent an hour driving them back before the camp settled. Small work. But they were trying to slow us, and I knew it. At the well near Nahor, the servant prayed. I stood beside him, unseen, and listened. "Lord, God of my master Abraham," the servant said, "give me success today. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too,' let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac." Before he finished praying, Rebekah came. I've been watching for decades. Watching for God's movements, for the quiet provisions, for the moments where the plan advanced through what looked like ordinary life. I'd learned to see it at the covenant vision. I'd felt it at the binding. But I'd never seen it work this fast. The servant was still forming the words in his mouth, and the answer was already walking toward him with a jar on her shoulder. She was young, strong. She carried the jar with the easy confidence of a woman who'd done this work every day and didn't resent it. The servant asked for water. She gave it. Then, without being asked, she said the words. "I'll draw water for your camels too," Rebekah said. 10 camels, after a long journey. That's not a small offer. That's an hour of hard labor at the well, hauling water jar after jar while the animals drink. The servant stood silent, watching her work, and I could read the wonder on his face. Could this be the one? This clearly? This quickly? Yes, this clearly. God's guidance sometimes looked like answered prayer before the prayer was finished. Rebekah proved to be Abraham's great niece. Her family agreed to the arrangement. And Rebekah, when asked if she would go to a land she'd never seen to marry a man she'd never met, gave an answer that echoed across decades. "I will go," Rebekah said. 3 words, the same 3 words, in substance, that Abraham had spoken when God called him out of Ur. The same faith. The same obedience without full understanding. The same willingness to leave the known for the unknown on the strength of a call she believed was real. The pattern repeating. Not because humans copied each other, because God kept finding people whose yes outweighed their uncertainty. I escorted them back to Canaan. Isaac met Rebekah in the field near Beer Lahai Roi, the well where God had found Hagar in the wilderness. Isaac brought her into his mother's tent, and she became his wife, and he was comforted after his mother's death. Abraham died at 175 years old. Full of years, Scripture would say later, and that was accurate. The years were full of faith and failure, full of altars and lies, full of promises given and promises kept, and the long grinding patience of believing when the evidence said don't. Angels gathered, more than had gathered for Sarah, not because Abraham mattered more, but because the scope of what he represented was vast. Friend of God, Father of nations, the man through whom the promise had narrowed from all humanity to one specific line. A century of heaven's investment in one fragile, faithful, deeply flawed human life. I'd guarded him for 100 years. I'd fought on the wall in Egypt while his lie put Sarai in danger. I'd watched him refuse Sodom's wealth and laugh at God's impossible promise and raise a knife over his own son and lower it when the voice called from heaven. I'd seen him at his worst and at his best, and the distance between those two was wider than most humans ever traveled. He wasn't perfect, wasn't even close, but he'd been faithful. And God had counted that as righteousness, not because Abraham had earned it, but because Abraham had believed it, and God honored belief the way a father honors a child's trust. Abraham died the way he'd lived, quietly, without spectacle. He lay in his tent with Isaac beside him, and his household gathered near, and his breathing slowed as Sarah's had slowed, and then it stopped. No final words that I could hear, no dramatic last prayer. Just a man who had walked with God for 100 years, reaching the end of the road and lying down. I stood outside the tent and felt the weight of his absence settle over the camp. For a century, the spiritual atmosphere around Abraham's household had carried a particular quality, the residue of a life lived in proximity to God's promises. Prayers rising from his altar every morning. The faint trace of the covenant hovering over his tent. The warmth that came from being near a human who believed, imperfectly but persistently, that God meant what he said. That warmth was gone now. The camp felt colder. Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury him. I hadn't seen Ishmael in years. He'd grown into a man in the desert of Paran, strong and weathered, an archer, the father of his own growing family. He arrived at Hebron with a small escort and stood at the edge of the camp looking in, and his face carried the complicated expression of a son returning to a home that had sent him away. Isaac met him at the boundary. The brothers looked at each other. They hadn't spoken since Isaac was a child, since the weaning feast, since the mocking that had driven the wedge that Abraham's choice with Hagar had made possible. 20 years, maybe more. And now their father was dead, and the only thing they shared was the grief. I thought of the wilderness, of Hagar's voice when she'd laid the boy down in the scrub and walked away, of the water God had opened in the desert for a woman and a child who were not the covenant line. I'd carried that with me ever since, the same way I carried everything, without knowing where it fit. Standing here now, watching those two men reach toward each other across a distance that wasn't just years, I still didn't know. Yeah, but I felt it. The weight of what one family's choices had cost. They carried him to the cave of Machpelah together, not servants. The two sons. Abraham's body between them, wrapped in linen, lighter than he should have been because death takes the substance out of a man and leaves only the frame. They walked side by side down the path to the cave where Sarah already lay, and they moved with the careful coordination of men who don't know each other well but are united by the weight they're carrying. They laid Abraham beside Sarah. In the dark of the cave, in the tomb he'd purchased with silver, in the first and only piece of the promised land he'd ever legally owned. Husband beside wife. The man who'd lied for her beside the woman who'd stayed despite it. Ishmael stood at the cave entrance after the body was placed. He looked at Isaac. Isaac looked back. Whatever passed between them in that silence was theirs, not mine, but I saw Ishmael's hand move to his brother's shoulder and rest there for a moment before falling away. Not healed, but bridged. One afternoon, two sons honoring one father, two lines diverging from one root, both of them carrying something of Abraham forward, but only one carrying the covenant. Michael stood beside me as they sealed the cave. Ariel was there, on the ridge above the cave, alone, watching. He hadn't been present at any of the burial preparations, hadn't shown himself during Abraham's final days. But he was here now. I could feel him before I saw him, that particular weight of a familiar presence carrying something I'd learned to read across a century of opposition. Not triumph, he hadn't won, but not defeat either, something in between. The long patience of a commander who has fought a campaign and lost the objective, but knows the war continues. He looked at the cave. Then he looked at me. He didn't speak. Neither did I. After a moment he turned and was gone, and whatever he was planning for Isaac, he was already beginning to plan it. "Your assignment is complete," Michael said. "Isaac now?" I said. "Isaac now," Michael confirmed. "The seed continues through him, and you continue with it." I looked at the sealed cave where Abraham lay beside Sarah. 100 years. Wars fought and crises survived, promises kept and a shield lost, a scar gained. A pattern half seen and still not understood. "He was a good man," I said. "He was a faithful man," Michael said. "There's a difference." I sat with that. Thought about the lies, about Egypt and Gerar, about Hagar and the child sent into the desert, about the knife and Isaac and the ram in the thicket. Faithful didn't mean careful, didn't mean right. I still didn't entirely understand what God saw in him. What made belief the thing that counted when so much else had failed? But I'd watched it for 100 years, and whatever it was, I knew I'd seen it. "Go," Michael said. "Isaac is waiting, and so is the next generation of the promise." I left the grave. Found Isaac at Beer Lahai, the well where God had found Hagar, the place where mercy had extended beyond the covenant line. Isaac lived there now. Near the water, God had provided for someone else's son. The geography felt deliberate. He was a quiet man, Isaac. Less dramatic than his father. Less prone to grand gestures of faith and spectacular failures of nerve. He prayed in the evenings and tended his flocks and loved his wife and believed the promise without needing to test it. The seed continued through him and through his children when they came. And on, generation after generation, each one carrying the promise forward even when they didn't fully understand what they were carrying. I stood at my post. The darkness burned on my arm, carried its low ache. My hands were empty where the shield had been. My being carried the accumulated weight of centuries on earth, the texture and grain that the pristine angels in the upper regions would never know. But the promise was alive. And the pieces I'd been carrying since the garden, the ones that had grown heavier on the mountain at Moriah until I thought they'd crush me, were still with me. Abel's lamb, Noah's altar, the covenant blood, Melchizedek's bread and wine, the ram on the mountain, fathers and sons, sacrifice and substitution, blood and provision. God was building something. I didn't know what. Didn't know when I'd see it completed. But somewhere along the way, between and Egypt and the covenant and the binding and the grave at Machpelah, I'd stopped doing this out of obedience alone. I'd started doing it out of hope. Hope that the seed would lead somewhere worth all the fighting and failing and trying again. Worth all the blood and altars and impossible births. Worth the shield I'd lost and the scar I carried and the woman with the lamp in Sodom whose face I'd never forget. Hope that God knew what he was doing, even when I didn't. hoped that someday the pieces would connect. I had time, and I would use every moment of it watching for that day.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.